Hey folks, we're live. It is January 13th, Monday, the year of our Lord 2025, or the year of some of our Lord, because Lord knows he's not my Lord, but whatever. It's 8 a.m. The sun is shining. The birds are chirping. It's going to be a great effing day because you are
watching Dog Shirt TV. Oh, sorry, I did it wrong.
Yeah, that's okay. Go for it.
See, the problem is it repeats everything you say. So
Yeah. Well, let's try it again. You're watching Dog Shirt TV, a fucking revolution in morning television.
Okay. You're watching Dog Shirt TV, an effing revolution in morning television.
That just makes me happy. You know, folks, we got a very serious show for you today, which we always try to introduce with a cactus talking to John Roush. But before we do, we got to talk about my hater on Blue Sky, because Holly has just informed me that the hater had words for me. So yesterday, somebody said, apropos of nothing, that she stopped watching or listening to, I assume she meant watching on YouTube, the Lawfare podcast during the Trump trials because of me. And that hurt my feelings. And so I responded cheekily, as I am wont to do, that, yeah, I hate that guy too. I have to live with him all the time. And Anna Bauer added some stuff, just imagine if he were your boss, or blah, blah, blah. And according to Holly, the individual has now responded.
Although Jeff says she's now deleted the post, but I saw it before she deleted it.
Okay, so what did she say?
Well, she explained very rationally and fulsomely that she finds you arrogant, and that it took away from the good expert. And also, you're not a real lawyer, and she is. And so you have no reason to be arrogant, because I guess being a lawyer is the only reason that one would have to be arrogant. I can be pretty arrogant, and I'm not a lawyer, so I don't know how that works.
Although you're not really working in the legal field.
Oh, I see. But I mean, just generally out in the world. Anyway, I didn't know how to, I was debating a response. I don't like to be rude to people. So I was just going to say, like, I know Ben personally, and he is actually not arrogant at all. It's just that, he does know a lot of things despite having gone to law school. And, I don't know.
All right. Well, number one of the two, I get to plead my case here. Of the two complaints, number one, that I'm arrogant, and number two, that I'm not a lawyer, plead guilty to both. I am arrogant, and I am not a lawyer. And I try to control the arrogance, because...
Oh, I know a lot of arrogant people.
Well, look, I do a pretty good job controlling it, but every now and then there are these eagle-eyed people, usually who are lawyers, who point out that I am not a lawyer and that I'm arrogantly posing as one. And to all of them, I say, no, seriously, if you're
very kind and restrained.
Yeah. So there we go. All right, let's talk about Sudan, because we're enjoying ourselves too much. I am just going to interview you on this, and I'm going to be really unarrogant and not really say very much. I'm just going to wind you up and press the cactus button. And so, but let me set it up for a minute. A few years ago, we had this lovely, part Orange Revolution, part Arab Spring thing going on in Sudan. And it was like really exciting. And now we have the worst humanitarian crisis in the world. So, what happened and why does nobody care about it?
Well, let me just address the humanitarian crisis first, because that might people wonder why they should care, why they should care. I don't. I can address why nobody is caring later, but this literally is the world's worst humanitarian crisis. And just to give you an idea, so Sudan at the beginning of all this had a population of about 50 million, and estimates of 8 to 10 million people are displaced. 2 million people have fled to neighboring countries, most of which are unstable themselves, like Chad. South Sudan has received a lot of, some of them are returnees because people fled their civil war to Sudan and now they're returning, fleeing another civil war. Ethiopia, which has also had a lot of instability, and into Egypt, which is better, but the Egyptians have been off and on hospitable and they're strained as well. They're also receiving refugees from other crises. About half the remaining population is under famine. There's famine, like full-blown famine. The U.S. just, after a very long process, people don't realize what goes into declaring a genocide. It's a policy designation that takes a lot of inputs. But the U.S. just declared a genocide happening in Darfur, which this is, of course, the second time that's happened in this century. 2004 was the first time. And, even the side that was not sanctioned for genocide has been committing all kinds of human rights abuses and atrocities, massive scale of rape and sexual assault as a weapon of war. So many I mean, it's just like Gaza is tragic and sad, but I would say Sudan eclipsed that. Well, by the numbers, it eclipses it.
What do we know about the death toll?
The death toll is largely unknown, but the estimates are, it's officially 15 to 20,000. The war began in April 2023, so coming up on 2 years. But the unofficial death toll I've seen as high as 100,000. And frankly, it's probably closer to that because one of the issues is it's hard to get information out of Sudan. I think one of the things I've covered other civil wars in Africa, and one of the things that's unique about this one, and also in Sudan's own history, unique about this war started in the capital of Khartoum and basically decimated the capital before. I mean, it was raging in other areas of the country, but that was really the center point of the war for a while. And the capital is completely decimated. The government fled to Port Sudan on the Red Sea. And so oftentimes you see in countries, particularly in Africa, developing countries, the capital is sort of, where all the resources and much of the population and in wartime becomes kind of a safe haven. Like it's the one place where the government sort of controls. You see this in South Sudan. So South Sudan has raging communal violence on a good day, but Juba, the capital, has been relatively stable for a number of years now, relatively stable.
But Sudan's the opposite.
Well, I mean, in the past, that's been the case. Khartoum was kind of a island, a stable island, and the government could sort of function, and diplomats could come in. And I mean, you may recall, or maybe you don't recall, I know this very well because I was intimately involved in this. We had to evacuate the embassy the SEALs had to come in and get our folks because the airport was one of the first things destroyed. It was the runway was completely destroyed, and getting our folks out was incredibly dangerous and difficult. And it's one of the, it's one of the proudest things that I've worked on, is helping, is being involved in that operation. But, so that's usually unusual. Usually our diplomat, like the Ethiopian Civil War, for instance, a couple years ago, we didn't evacuate the embassy. Addis Ababa was safe. The war was taking place up north.
Right. It's a little bit more like Mogadishu.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah.
All right. So what is this war about? One thing that I think um, makes it easy to latch on to things like China, Tibet, Israel, Palestine, is that you kind of viscerally understand without a whole lot of explanation. And sometimes that understanding can be very facile. But your average teenager or early 20 something can put a bumper sticker on their car that says "Free Tibet," right? Or, or Free Gaza or whatever. Like, people kind of intuitively understand, again, often misunderstand, but think they understand what it's about. The Sudan war, um, I think people actually have no idea what it's about. And I kind of count myself among those people. I'm aware that it's going on, aware that there's really no good side, but one really bad side, and the UAE is playing a really awful role. But, at its core, I don't actually understand what the conflict is about.
Got you, man. I got you. Well, like many conflicts, it's a, lasagna of causes, going back in the past, much like Israel, Gaza. So long making the deep background very short, as with all of Africa, colonial boundaries drawn very arbitrarily, and surrounding communities that don't have the same interests, don't get along with each other, are ethnically, linguistically, culturally, religiously divided, and lumps them into a country that's supposed to function. And in Sudan's case, a very geographically large country. And so, and then privileging some over others. So that's another very common colonial dynamic that drives a lot of conflict. And in the case of Sudan, the riverine, we call them the riverine Arabs. So the Arabs that live around Sudan and in environs around the Nile River, the capital became, still is the most, well, now not, it's destroyed, but the most developed area. That's where the colonial government had their bureaucracy. They hired those people to work in the bureaucracy, and this sort of privileged them and set them up for a post-colonial control and power.
And the colonial power was Britain, right?
Britain, and then Egypt. They had and frankly, I can't really explain what this is, but it was called a condominium. It's like a nice condo board with the British and the Egyptians, and I'm sure those were like really fun.
Yeah, those condo meetings must have been
Yeah.
lit.
So Egypt retains, by the way, a really keen interest in Sudan. They just are not in a position to do a whole lot about it right now, and I can explain that more later. But so basically, over time, they got independence in the 50s, and over time, well, starting from the beginning, well back in the colonial background, but it solidified over time. It's in Sudanese terminology, center versus periphery dynamic, where the riverine Arabs in around Khartoum are the privileged ones, the education ones, the ones in power. The military becomes kind of their institution, and really has run the country for most of Sudan's history. And then the periphery, different areas of the country that are underdeveloped, again, can be different ethnicities or ethnically divided, have different religious interests as well, especially when Sudan's government has been Islamist and has been more forceful about forcing that on other people, that created a lot of conflict, because in the South, people were not Muslim. They were Christian or traditional African, but not Muslim. And so this dynamic spawned multiple rebellions, including the one that eventually resulted in the creation of South Sudan, which became independent in 2011. But also, there's multiple rebel groups all over the country. And Darfur's been a big area of conflict in Sudan because it's ethnically divided. There's Arab groups and there's African groups, and these are very grossly generalized
Yep.
categories. They do tend to all be Muslim in Darfur, but there's ethnic divisions, and so there's multiple rebellions that has sprung up in Darfur, and those became an existential threat to the Bashir regime in the early part of the century. And he created this. Bashir is the former dictator, military dictator, who was also
And that's Omar al-Bashir, right? Who's been, among other things, indicted by the ICC.
and is still alive somewhere in Sudan, as far as I know. He's had a rough time the last couple years.
Well, he's welcome on Dogshirt TV anytime to talk about his troubles
Yeah, it's been
and
a
talk
rough
to the
time for him.
cactus.
Couldn't happen to a nicer guy, you
Yeah.
know. So anyway, Dictator 101. Okay, here's some tips, some dictator tips. If you want to be like a good dictator, it's a very hard job. I don't think people realize, Ben, it is actually incredibly difficult to be an effective dictator. Did you realize that? I know you're a bit of a dictator.
So I am hey, that's a very pejorative term for it. First of all,
You're arrogant. So
I am arrogant. But secondly, there's a really big difference between me and a dictator, which is dictators by their nature are insecure. Because
very secure.
they're really insecure because people want to kill them, and I am actually like really secure, which you got to be really secure in your, to wear a dog shirt on TV, and to as you have to be really secure in your masculinity to make Get Ready With Me videos as a middle-aged male, right? So like I just want to point out that comparing me to a dictator understates the serene comfort in my existence that I have, unlike virtually any dictator. That's
Okay.
one of the benefits of powerlessness.
All right. Okay, so Dictator 101, you have to always be thinking about the possibility of a coup. And of course the military is a problem in that it's a love-hate relationship with the military. You got to have the military, but then they can also come for you because they've got the guns. So
Right.
if they want to turn on you, then that you can do that. I mean, they can do that, and
And of course, see Machiavelli and his discussions of the Roman emperors. This is a central theme.
Yeah. So what most dictators do is they'll have a sort of Praetorian Guard, so to speak, an alternative force that's more loyal and that they can sort of count on. And usually that's kind of a presidential, like a Secret Service type of thing. But in some cases, in Bashir's case, because he was facing like an active war in Darfur and in South Sudan, he had a lot of challenges. Like, I mean, props to him for surviving as long as he did, just on a pure dictator scale, because he had a lot of challenges. But so he created a whole paramilitary, which is evolved into the rapid support.
And this is the Janjaweed?
It started out as the Janjaweed, and it's evolved into the RSF, which is one of the sides in this conflict. So it started as a Janjaweed to terrorize. He sort of funded these Arab militias and gave them free rein. But over time, it became more and more of a formalized paramilitary.
By the way, just while we're giving praise for terrible people doing terrible things, which probably we should be careful about doing, but I just want to say that the Janjaweed is a great name.
Yeah.
Up there with the Haitian Tonton Macoute.
I don't speak
For
Arabic, but I think it means something like dudes on horses because they would maraud around and
It's a great name, and it like should be the name of a punk rock band or something instead of a,
that it's a genocidal.
yeah, except for the genocidal.
That does kind of ruin it.
Yeah. Well, it makes it badass for punk rock purposes.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, I think even punk rockers have like lines more.
Standards.
I think.
I
Anyway,
don't
I'm
know. Anyway, you were saying.
world. So I on my world. Anyway, the Janjaweed, terrorized and cooperated with the regular military in Darfur, but really did Bashir's dirty work in Darfur. That was sort of beneath the regular military, and also he wanted to maintain some sort of plausible deniability because he had been under sanctions since the 90s for harboring Osama bin Laden and other terrorists, and so he was a very poor attempt of trying to like distance himself from these atrocities, but he was definitely behind them. So anyway, over time, the Janjaweed becomes the RSF, and it becomes a really professional, well, not terribly professional, but a paramilitary, like a more slick, capable, not just forces, but other things, paramilitary under a guy named Hameti. And the Hameti family is a wealthy, I mean, they got wealthy through the Janjaweed and taking money from Bashir, but also they were gifted, gold mines and things like that. So very wealthy. And it became a personalist paramilitary for the Hameti family over time. So anyway, fast forward to 2019, large protests in Khartoum. Finally, Sudan gets kind of its Arab Spring moment years after other countries, and the military and the paramilitary kind of team up as they had in the past. I mean, again, in Darfur, to overthrow Bashir. And that's the hopeful moment that you were talking about.
And
And
just to be clear about, like, we were writing articles on lawfare at the time about constitutional process in Sudan, um and what the composition of a working constitution would look like. And that was not eccentric. That was an ongoing discussion between the
yeah,
military and the civilian
no,
sectors. And
they
it's only 5 years ago.
yeah, no, this 2019, I guess almost 6 years ago now.
We had an awesome Egyptian American uh, uh, Brookings. She was a research assistant at Brookings on her way to law school, and she got very interested in the Sudanese constitutional moment and did a bunch of writing for Lawfare about it.
Yeah.
Her name is Isra Saber. And if you read it now, it looks completely naive, and it wasn't. It was completely reasonable. That's where. So what the heck happened? How did it fall apart?
They pretty quickly formed. There wasn't even a long, lengthy negotiation, a transitional arrangement between the military, the RSF, and a civilian body called the Forces for Freedom and Change. And they had a civilian prime minister, and they had a roadmap, and things went along for a few years. They're not smoothly all the time, but if you take the long view, it was always naive. First of all, so a few different problems. First of all, the civilians, okay? Sudan has had I can probably count on one hand the number of years that Sudan has been under civilian government in its entire history. Like, it has been a military regime, and so therefore there's just not a lot of practice in doing politics in Sudan. The civilians were a fractious, you know, many different groups with all kinds of opinions on things like how big a role should Islam be in the state, et cetera, et cetera. They just the basic processes of organizing themselves, they could not get it together. And frankly, I think personally, I've been harder on the civilians than many others. I think they deserve some of the blame. They had years to make progress on their side and to get themselves together, and they had a lot of assistance and support from the international community, and they just couldn't get it together. And so the military used that as a pretext. Let's just be honest, because I don't know how serious the military was ever about truly handing over power to the civilians. So the military used that as a pretext, and in 2021, there was a military coup, I guess, where the military basically kicked out the civilians and took over the whole government, and that became the dissent, really. And then the issue became, when this was always there from the beginning, was you have to integrate the RSF and the regular military. So democracy 101, dictator 101, you create your parallel military force. Democracy 101, or just, even dictator, Putin had this trouble, right? When you have two competing militaries, that's not safe for the long term. Like you have to, one military is a good rule of thumb. Not a best practice to have two militaries for a functioning state. So this was always sort of hanging out there. And then there were more negotiations to try to get things back on track, and the civilians continued to, but by the time the military took over, the civilians really were completely out of it. Oh, and then you have the different rebel groups mixed in there as well. Those are still around. That's another whole complication.
All right, but so help me out. There is a difference. There are a lot of countries that have had proto-democracy movements that go X far, and then the military steps in and says enough of that shit, and does something very authoritarian. See Egypt to the north, right?
Yeah.
See, I don't know, you can go, if you want to, we can talk about Chile, right? I mean, there's lots of, without getting genocidal. The Egyptians killed a lot of people in of Morsi's people, but it was 1,000 people, not 100,000 people, right? The Chileans and the Argentinians did a certain amount of dropping people out of helicopters. But again, it's, the whole, I don't mean to understate the seriousness of that. It was super, super authoritarian and murderous. It's not what's going on in Sudan. And so my question is, how do you go from garden variety military coup to squelch a democracy movement to, genocide?
So the genocide is kind of an offshoot of the main conflict. The main conflict is the RSF. Basically, the RSF and the military never trusted each other, but it was this uncomfortable two-headed relationship since they teamed up to get rid of Bashir. And so this confrontation of who is top dog was sort of always in the background. And the, suspicion and paranoia and just continued to build. Hameti, the paramilitary leader, continued to, get stronger and sort of array his forces and build up his money and weaponry and material. And then in April of 2023 decided for various reasons, that was the time to make his move. And as far as we can tell, the RSF started the conflict. But the SAF, the military, was poised to respond, very forcefully. They had been circling each other and eyeing each other, the whole time. So when the spark became a flame, like it just became a conflagration very quickly. And the and then the reason it's become a protracted conflict is the two forces are kind of mismatched militarily. So conventionally, the SAF, the military, I call it the SAF, the Sudan Armed Forces. So the SAF um, is stronger. Okay. And many people thought that and they had air power versus the RSF had none. Okay. So we thought, oh, well, they've got the upper hand. But see, air power, when you have a paramilitary using insurgency tactics, air power, unless you're prepared to.
Keep talking, Holly. I need to take a phone call. I'm
Okay,
going to
sure.
mute myself.
Okay. Unless you're prepared to just systematically bomb civilians, which is unfortunately what has ended up happening in various cases, that kind of insurgency tactics render your conventional military pretty useless. So Khartoum became, a huge battleground where the RSF infiltrated neighborhoods and civilian populations, and then the SAF tried to confront them. At first, trying a little bit to protect civilians, but was never very good at that. And gradually, the whole city got destroyed. And then they sort of retreated to their corners. Khartoum remains contested, although the SAF has had some victories recently, but it's changed hands and different neighborhoods have changed hands. So Khartoum remains contested. The government of Sudan under the SAF, the official government, retreated to the east, to Port Sudan on the Red Sea, and they have a sort of government, skeleton government in Port Sudan. And the east they barely have consolidated their power in Port Sudan. And then Hamedi's center is Darfur, that's where he's from, and that's where his mountains of gold are. He has literal mountains of gold. So he largely controls Darfur, but the problem is that there's still non-hospitable African groups, these rebel groups. And also there's still a SAF presence in Darfur because the SAF has bases in Darfur. So
All right, I'm back.
Okay. I've just explained, I forget what I explained, but anyway, I'm talking about Darfur now. So Darfur has become very contested still as Hamedi tries to shore up full control of that region where he's from and what he thinks he deserves. And the military remains there in some places, and then these rebel groups supported by African ethnic communities remain there. So the genocide, both in the early part of the century and now, like early 2000s and now, I don't think it was the main goal. It was a means to an end of controlling Darfur or defeating, in Bashir's case, defeating these rebellions in Darfur. And now Hamedi is facing those same rebellions as well as confronting the SAF. So that's why there's genocide. There's obviously long ethnic, and then the thing about conflict is the cycles of retribution just layer on top of each other. And you see that in the Middle East, right?
Right.
It's just like layers and layers of retribution, retributive cycles.
All right, so help me out though. Why does anybody outside the country, why are they getting involved in this? So the UAE is famously being the bad guy here. Why? What is whose objective among the outside players, and how are they getting involved?
So they each have their own sort of calculations. For the UAE's been really meddling around in Africa for a while now, and ostensibly for economic interests. They're particularly wanting farmland. They want to sort of expand some agricultural presence in Africa. That doesn't explain Darfur. Obviously, it's not hospitable to agriculture. But in the case of Darfur and Hameti, there's just a long relationship there. They have a lot of personal ties. they've been laundering his gold money for a long, long time. That's how he gets his money. He and then really the RSF became a mercenary force in Yemen and Libya and some other places. So they they have ties through that, and there's sort of a loyalty there. So some of it's a personal relationship, some of it's economics, like the gold. I mean, Hamedi controls a lot of gold. Some of it, I just, again, it's part of UAE's larger ambitions in Africa
You
that I
pick a
don't.
side, you invest in the side,
Right.
and eventually they take over and you own them.
That's right. That's right. So you pick. That's what all this is about. People trying to game it out, like who's you pick a side, who's going to win. How do we? And then countering. So like Iran is not directly involved, but has through proxies and cutouts and things like that has supplied the SAF. Okay, because UAE is involved, right? So you see, and then
Right,
Saudi
and
involved,
just to unpack that for people, UAE, Iran, bitter enemies, um,
then
Gulf
Houthi.
Arabs functionally allied with Israel against Iran. So UAE gets involved. Iran says, all right, the other side, whoever they are, will make them ours.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's become a proxy issue there with the Middle East. Saudi has been a key negotiator, trying to sort of, they've hosted talks, for instance.
So the Saudis are not, usually the Saudis and the UAE are
Yeah.
kind of tied at the hip.
No,
Here they're not. The
yeah,
Saudis are
Saudi
playing
is,
a constructive role.
generally speaking, yeah. Yeah, I think they've they're sort of got tired of it after a while, so they're not as involved right now, I don't think, but they're not playing a destructive role. And then Egypt is an interesting case. Oh, the other thing about the UAE's interest too is the SAF is, again, the old Bashir. The SAF contains the old remnants of the old Islamist Bashir, and there's a hysteria in the Arab world about the Muslim Brotherhood and sort of political Islam. And so the UAE has concerns about that. And there are those old Islamists, hardcore Islamists, sort of running around in on that side of the conflict.
And just to go back a little further in history, and I'm gonna forget his name, but one of Bashir's, his like prime minister for a while in the 90s, was an Osama bin Laden
Yeah,
linked
the whole regime was. Yeah,
hardcore
yeah.
what was his name? Remind me.
Are you thinking of Tarabi?
Yeah, Hassan Tarabi. Yeah, so there was, and the UAE has a pathological anti-brotherhood.
Yeah.
To the extent there's an ideology at all, it's anything that smacks of the
Right.
brotherhood.
So they're very paranoid about that. But then Egypt, who also doesn't like the Brotherhood, and doesn't like the hardcore Islamists, their calculation has been a bit different because they have such a long relationship with the Sudanese military. Going back to the condominium board, and the Riverine Arabs and all of that. There's ties there. So Egypt has been generally pro Saf, even though, again, these Islamists are there. They sort of can explain it away. But then the interesting twist with Egypt's involvement, they were more involved on the South side of the world early on, but then Egypt's economy is in shambles, and they had to go begging to the UAE, and UAE extended them a large loan and basically has Egypt over a barrel. So that
Right,
has,
stay out of our sphere of influence, basically.
yeah. So Egypt has, I think, still emotionally is definitely pro South, but they've retreated in involvement because of the UAE influence. And then Russia, Ukraine. This is really interesting, guys. So Russia's interest in Sudan is they have long. Well, first of all, anytime the West is trying to get a democracy movement going, as we were post Bashir, we were supporting this nascent movement. They like to wreck that and meddle with that because they just, they like to bother us, right? So there's that, but then also they have long coveted a naval logistics base on the Red Sea. Sudan's eastern coast is a very strategic. It's a very strategic location. Sudan geographically is really at the crossroads of a lot of things, but then the fact that they have this Red Sea port is key as well. So the Russians have been eyeing this conflict and kind of trying to figure out which side they should be on for a really long time. And before Prigozhin was killed, his
That's
outfit,
Wagner Group
Wagner,
chieftain Yevgeny Prigozhin.
yeah, they had a large presence in Sudan, and were really on the Hemeti side. They were sort of they were sort of sponsoring Hemeti and trying to boost him. They saw him as maybe the winning one. And Hemeti had legitimate visions for, or not, his visions weren't legitimate, but he had visions for legitimate political power as well. Like he thought he could sort of rise to power through this political process. And I think he made his move militarily when he figured that wasn't coming to pass. So Wagner was really a booster of Hemeti. And so SAF was kind of not anti-Russia per se, but suspicious of Russia, kind of playing them a little bit, using this port to sort of mess with them a little bit, this port ambition. But then Prigozhin was killed and Wagner largely pulled out. And then it became a kind of a chaotic mess of Russian interests. And right now it seems that they're siding primarily with the SAF. And again, they've revived this whole ambition for the naval logistics space. But what's funny is that some reports indicate that Ukraine began funding and helping the SAF when Prigozhin was helping Hemeti.
So and now Russia and Ukraine are sort of
like on the same side of this conflict. It's
hard to believe, though, that Ukraine would spend any significant money on a conflict beyond its shores.
It is. They're not spending. It's. I don't want to say too much. They see it as an interest. I mean, certainly Russia sees. It's kind of like the new Cold War, where it's my interest because it's my enemy's interest. Right. And so,
all right. So yeah. I have one more question on foreign involvement, but let's go to Joel first. Joel, what's on your mind?
Morning, all.
How cold is it in the great far north?
Here in Minneapolis, it's -2 out. However, I will say I did have a personal best a couple of weekends ago. I went out for a ski at -17. And that was really something. I have to admit.
That sounds really unpleasant, Joel.
Dangerous.
Yeah, that was cool. Anyway.
All right. What's on your mind?
So something I've been thinking a lot about lately and not coming up with any really decent thoughts whatsoever on my own is a lot of the stuff that I see and read is that there is some reasonable argument that the Russian military is not going to be able to keep this up forever. And so the thing I was kind of curious about, are there telltale signs when an authoritarian system is going to collapse? Because I would love to keep an eye out for, like, seeing the canaries in the coal mine starting to die. That would be fantastic. It would fill me with, optimism to go, oh, look, I see one. I see a thing. This is good, So I was kind of curious, with all of your experience with regimes changing and the way the systems work, is there something a person could look for in a Ukraine-Putin situation that could give us hope?
Yeah, Joel, good question. There are sort of, some indicators, people who study sort of coups in academia, there's various indicators, but My experience is it's actually really hard. You can see a regime crumbling. That's easy. You can sort of, and I think Russia's long fit those metrics. There's a lot of warning signs, but when things actually collapse is pretty unpredictable because
Super hard to predict.
it is, because it's kind of a crowd mentality, right? Ultimately, a leader can stay in power forever as long as the military, like he has guns, I call them guys. He has guys with weapons who are loyal to him and will keep him in power. And the sort of political military elite, it's kind of like musical chairs, where like everybody's circling the chairs knowing like the music's going to stop, and I want to position myself, but I don't want to position myself too early, or like I don't want to be the one that goes first because then I'll get my head cut off, like where's this going? Everybody's trying to read the inner circle, and the sort of key levers of power are trying to read the room. And it's so that's why it's incredible for an outsider, even for an insider, like they have a hard time because it's this crowd mentality at the end of the day. So you have many regimes and dictators. Salva Kiir in South Sudan, Lord have mercy. Like he should have, his regime's been crumbling from the beginning. They've had civil war. Like it's like but he's able to hang on. They keep the elites off balance. And the military, Salva Kiir is always shuffling people. They have their Praetorian Guard that will protect them.
And a huge amount of it really has to do with the political culture of the civil society. So if you had said in 1985 that of the major communist regimes, the only survivors would be China, Vietnam, North Korea, and Cuba, that would have been a ridiculous proposition. Note that Vietnam and China have both remained authoritarian but become relentlessly capitalist. North Korea has become, even more hermetic than it used to be. But the other North Korea, which is Albania, has, become democratic, and Romania too, right? The other North Korea-like countries collapsed. And by the way, Cuba, which is the one that has had the most relentless pressure for the longest time from the United States, has managed to hang on. So and then there's the case of Iran, which has had, one color revolution after another completely unsuccessfully, despite having a population that clearly wants democratic and social reform. So I think, like Putin's regime will fall eventually. But whether that eventually is a week from now or 5 years from now or 15 years from now is a real mug's game to try to predict. And I'm on a bunch of these listservs where people trade very excited information about the state of the Russian economy and that sanctions are kicking in and it's all going to collapse. It's all a house of cards, as the Financial Times put it the other day. And I am sure in some macro sense they're right. But you got to tell me what the time wave is before that's a useful statement. And
there's just no way to do that. I mean, here's the thing, like you can have popular protest. A dictator can stay in power through popular protest as long as and let's face it, they're all he's. Has there been any female dictators? I don't know.
Well, sure-ish. The Bangladeshi.
Okay.
There are a few.
We'll be inclusive. There could be a female
and
dictator.
You got to include, I have a soft spot in my heart for Imelda Marcos. She was kind of,
Inclusive. okay, they can stay in power as long through huge protests, whatever, as long as they have the guns, and also they don't mind killing civilians.
Right.
Like
They got to, it's not enough to have the guns. You got to
yeah,
be willing to use
you have
them.
to be willing to use
And
them.
then sometimes, like Viktor Yanukovych, you use them and it doesn't work. Because you don't have as many of the guns as you think you do.
Yeah. No, you gotta have the guns. And in Sudan, if you only have half the guns, then you have a civil war.
All
If
right.
you have the majority of the guns, then you can put down the rebellion, and you just maybe you might have an ongoing insurgency. Now that's another dynamic that exists in a lot of countries where you have just a nagging insurgency that goes on for decades.
So I want to go back to the foreign interference issue in Sudan. So one country you didn't mention in the whole litany of countries that are playing non-constructive or less non-constructive roles is the United States. Are we just basically not involved, or have we? I mean, I know we tried to work with the transitional government, and of course, we had a very bad relationship with Bashir, dating back to the Hassan Turabi period. What is our role in this?
Well, the U.S. has worked multilaterally with partners, including Saudi Arabia, actually, to try to negotiate I mean, the goals have been very modest at this point, just a ceasefire, even a localized ceasefire, and aid access. So that's one of the other tragedies in this is it's very hard to get aid in there because the infrastructure was poor to begin with. The violence is widespread and severe, and then the SAF has intentionally blocked aid because they think, with some reason, that the RSF is sort of infiltrated in certain aid convoys and things like that. So deep paranoia has blocked aid. So we've worked. We have a special envoy. Worked very hard to try to get any kind of talks going, and everything's been unsuccessful.
But we don't have a camp that we're supporting.
No, because both of them are bad. So, and then we've tried to, in the past, we've sort of put all our eggs in the civilian basket, and that's still like our official, what we want eventually is obviously we want the war to stop. We want access. We want ceasefire eventually, like all ceasefire, but even localized ceasefire, aid access, negotiated peace and civilian transition. And there's been a lot of programming with various civilian initiatives over the years to try to build up their capacity. But they're I hate to say it, but they're a very divided, feckless bunch. They're still trying to get something together. The main civilian bloc is probably too aligned with the RSF, frankly, and the UAE. And so that's compromised that. But the U.S., it's been like a flurry of activity, but without any kind of result, because we can't really pick a side. I mean, that's
right.
that's kind of been the armed. If we had it like Russia, Ukraine, if we can pick a side, then it's like you just go full bore, and that can make a difference. But if you're not picking a side, and in this case, I think it's appropriate not to pick a side because they're both awful. So they did announce the sanctions, and they've sanctioned various entities. They actually finally sanctioned Hemeti himself, and they sanctioned 7 companies in the UAE, which was the first time they've targeted the UAE even indirectly, because the UAE is an ally on Middle Eastern stuff. So, I mean, that's probably the one thing we could have done in the international is if you go really hard at the UAE, you could probably change the dynamic of the conflict. But
now,
the other side is really wanting to negotiate because they both see a path to victory. It's been a stalemate. Now the SAF had a big victory over the weekend. They captured a major crossroads town south of Khartoum, and they've had some success in Khartoum itself. Unfortunately, that's probably only going to discourage talks. You know, when military sides think they can win on the battlefield, they're not likely to go to the negotiating table. And both sides see it as a zero sum. They don't want to share power. They think they can win. I think where it's probably headed, if I could bet, is some sort of, I mean, the country is effectively partitioned at this point. And the RSF is already discussing setting up its own sort of government of sorts in the Darfur region. They will probably move ahead with that at some point, especially now that he's sanctioned.
So at the end of the day, how much of the Sudan problem is internally generated, and how much of it is the sort of classic story of external actors? Is this really in the sort of classic post-colonial narrative, it's always, former colonial powers or other actors meddling that causes the problems? And
that's a worn out narrative, frankly, that a lot of bad regimes use to their advantage. I don't doubt the evils of colonialism, but I mean, it's been a long time at this point. This is an internal problem. I mean, this is a civil war. Now, UAE, if you could isolate one destructive force that's adding fuel to the fire, it's definitely the UAE, because that's how Hemeti is funding his whole operation, is through exporting his gold and other business and ventures in the UAE. The UAE is also supplying like actual, material to Hemeti, and facilitating transport of supplies and things like that into the war zone. And so, UAE is definitely fueling the fire, but the fire is like the causes of the fire are internal.
All right. If any of the 7 emirs who constitute the United Arab Emirate, Dubai, Abu Dhabi, come on, Dogshirt TV, and defend yourselves against these,
They just deny that they're doing anything.
Yeah, if Yusuf Al-Taiba, the ambassador to the United States, I think that's his name, if you want to come on, well-spoken guy, come on the show and let's talk UAE policy in Sudan, Egypt, elsewhere.
Yeah, I come on and talk to him.
Yeah, exactly. Face Holly down. We got to leave it there, folks, because we are running out of time here. So, Holly, one more question. What are you looking for to adjust Joel's question slightly? What would be the telltale sign that things are improving, or that that we might see an improvement in Sudan?
So there is the latest peace initiative. Turkey seems to have maybe gotten some traction with getting UAE to talk to the SAF, so that's an initiative to keep an eye on. But honestly, I'm afraid this war is going to grind on. I don't see any end in sight. The SAF success is something to watch for sure, but I don't think it significantly changes the outlook of the war. Even if they were to recapture Khartoum, which would be good, that would probably be stabilizing anyway. They could start to rebuild the capital and whatever. But in terms of I think we're headed to a partition would be my best guess at this point.
All right. On that cheerful note, we will be back tomorrow. I don't have a guest. I don't know who's.
Yael.
Oh, Yael's coming tomorrow.
Yeah.
We do have a guest. We have Yael Eisenstadt, who was once upon a time a baby CIA analyst with one Holly Berkley Fletcher, went on to be a content moderation, disinformation expert at Facebook, where she locked horns with the powers that be and is now doing all kinds of other interesting stuff. So we are going to sit down with Yael and reminisce about the CIA cafeteria and that sort of thing. That'll be at 8 o'clock tomorrow morning. You should join us. We will be here.